Hi everyone, I'm Nikki Godden-Rasul. I'm a senior lecturer in the law school at Newcastle University Law School UK, and I've co-edited the research handbook on gender violence and law with my colleague Lucia Kula from SOAS in the UK. I'm really pleased to be talking with you and with Professor Gina Heathcote, who's feminist approaches to everyday, enduring and environmental violence. So Gina, do you want to just introduce yourself and talk a little bit about why you wanted to be part of the collection?
Yeah, thanks, Nikki. So my name's Professor Gina Heathcote, and I'm Professor of Public International Law, also at Newcastle Law School. So it's a real pleasure to be a part of the handbook. I think in particular, this bringing together of work on gender violence in the law really spoke to what I think is a central theme in my own scholarship, but also one that traverses feminist and queer and critical approaches more broadly, but hasn't always been brought together in a kind of sustained set of inquiries. So I think that the project itself allows a lot of different work that might speak to itself through this connecting of gender violence in the law, but might not always find itself in the same repository, so dealing with different areas of law, but also kind of different sub-disciplines and approaches within feminist legal theories in particular. So that's why it really spoke to me, and it also allowed me to pick up some work I was doing elsewhere on environmental security and hone in on a particular problem that I saw in the way environmental security was being articulated and understood within law.
Thanks, Gina. And I think this is one of the few reasons that we really wanted you to be part of the collection and write this chapter, is because you don't see in collections it typically is on gender-based violence, and you wouldn't often see work around environmental harm and the connections to gender, which is why we're really pleased to have you include this chapter. So will you tell listeners a little bit more about it?
Yeah, so my chapter actually pivots from another project which I was also involved in with Lucia Kula, my other editor, as a co-author, and together with Emily Jones and Sherry Lubinsky. It's a book on the law of war and peace, a gender analysis, and has a chapter on environmental security, which is a much bigger study. But what I really wanted to take away from that and kind of center a little bit more time on was this, what I thought was a central tension in the law on environmental security. So as an international lawyer, I look to the United Nations Security Council and how it articulates or speaks to environmental security or insecurity. And it has mostly done this through the mechanism of thematic resolutions and debates on the issue of climate change, peace and security. So what those debates and the kind of legal consequences or legal outputs do is they tend to focus on how climate change produces insecurity for some communities, which is of course a very important thing, and also when includes and incorporates gender as a mechanism for identifying gendered harms, or sometimes elevating women's voices as potential change makers around climate change, peace and security. But what's lost in that work and that kind of legal regime that's emerging in the work of the Security Council is any recognition of the relationship between both militarism and armed conflict and environmental security. So really use the chapter to explore both how armed conflict itself is a contributor to environmental insecurity, including climate change, militaries being the biggest polluters in the world and the biggest contributors to global warming, for example, but also how armed conflict itself is always directed not just at the human, but the non-human. And we've seen a kind of better surfacing of knowledge around that, I think, just globally since the genocide in Gaza from October 2023, but also what I look at in this chapter is Russian violence and Russian aggression in Ukraine, and how that's targeted the environment, and that the legacy of that will be long-lived. So I wanted to think about environmental insecurity, of course, change, but the role of reduction of that. The second example in the chapter turns to Oceania and looks at militarism rather than armed conflict per se, and pays attention to how nuclear testing in the Pacific has created a legacy of environmental harm and damage that is still understood today. And then across those two examples, so they hold gender violence and law in conversation, but I also look to alternative feminist voices and approaches that kind of know that violence in both environmental and human and against the human in a kind of intimate way, and are already producing ways to think differently about how we might change our response to gender violence and the law, in particular holding the human and the non-human as kind of harms that are intertwined, I guess, as a different way of thinking about gender violence and the law. Obviously, very influenced by the work of our other colleague, Emily Jones, in the chapter and in my thinking in this. So that's a synopsis. I hope that helps.
Thanks, Gina. I guess just to summarise, because I think you've already alluded to this, but maybe you could just kind of highlight the importance of the chapter, both for legal scholarship, but also feminist theory in particular.
Yeah, so I hope that there are two key kind of central contributions. One is about how we think about feminist voices and where we think about expertise and response. So a little bit of kind of returning to this idea, women are identified as experiencing gendered harms under armed conflict, or maybe change makers, but less often are we looking or seeking out to understand feminist traditions that might already also be offering ways of rethinking how we talk about environmental insecurity or climate change. So I think that's one, and it kind of frame that under the idea of plural feminisms, which I look at in a lot of my work. So I guess there's that kind of aspect. And I guess tied to that, and for feminist theories more generally, is to think about how we might use gender violence and the law, not just a descriptive project, not just of harms, but also as a kind of analytical project that allows us to develop different platforms for change, or to rethink some of the assumptions that we might have about law. For me, talking about gender violence in the law is always thinking about how is law co-opted into the perpetuation or the obscuring of violence that is also gendered. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you can see those themes kind of cutting across a number of the chapters in the handbook as well. So thanks very much for talking to everyone about your chapter, and I very much hope everyone listening really enjoys reading it. Thanks very much again.
Thanks,
Bye.
Nikki. Bye-bye.